In this longer than usual video presentation, we will be covering Moodle's Forms API. The video actually contains content from 3 different lessons in the course, and we are giving special attention to the file form elements, which can be quite challenging. I strongly suggest you watch the file API presentation prior to at least watching that part of this presentation. The content of this video has been extracted from the Moodle plugin development by example course from Mukudu Publishing. But before we start, if this video proves to be useful and informative, please don't forget to like it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel for more useful content in the future. If you are so inclined, click the bell notification to be informed when we upload new content. Okay, the Form API. The Moodle Form API is strongly based on a PHP extension and application repository, a pair library, an old version of HTML quick form, which was version 3.2. Okay. There's a link there if you want to have a look at it. But this is a great example of one of the legacy issues that kind of plague Moodle in some way, in that some things are so integrated that later versions have to kind of continue to support what would be regarded as old code. I mean, the pair libraries for quick form are now called quick form 2, and they were rewritten for PHP 5, and the current version of the actual library is now 2.20. So we are still working with the old version, and there's ways that it's been integrated into Moodle. Okay. So most Moodle forms using the API are extensions of the Moodle form class. Now, I've said most Moodle forms because occasionally, especially amongst plugin developers, some people don't use the API and define the forms directly in HTML. But the standard way across all the core components, and as a plugin developer, you should really stick to this, are extensions of the Moodle form class, which is defined in the forms lib PHP file in the lib folder. Okay. And the class is described as the wrapper that separates quick forms, which is the pair libraries syntax, from Moodle code. Okay, the exception to extending Moodle Forms class is with modules who have a Moodle Form _ mod class, itself an extension of Moodle Form, which adds particular useful functionality for course modules. For example, the standard _intro _elements, which we will talk about at some point later on. The Moodle Form and the Moodle _mod classes do not extend the HTML quick form class directly. Instead, there's a property $_form, which is the instance of the Moodle quick form class, which does in turn extend the pair library classes. Okay. Elements of the form are defined in the definition method. So you've always got to have a definition method, and that's where you define your elements, your fields for your form. And it must always be overridden, as I say there. Okay. And creating form elements normally requires the Moodle quick form add element method. So you've got to remember that the Moodle quick form is defined in the _form property. So generally, traditionally, the _mform property is assigned to a mform variable in the definition method. So for example, as you can see on the screen, this makes it easier to just call add element or whatever else you need to call of the methods of this form. And the mform object is what is normally passed not only in the block plugin, in several plugins where a plugin is adding fields to a configuration or settings form, you'll find that the mform is passed into the function. So the API supports several different types of elements. So we've got the basic elements, which are the standard HTML form elements. Remember, the PHP 5, the HTML5, the later HTML elements are not defined as standard HTML form elements because we're using an old library. There are some custom elements that kind of cover for that. Okay, so we've got custom elements, and custom elements are extensions of normally base element classes. and they are created by calling register element type of the Moodle quick form class. Okay, so you're normally extending. So if you create a custom element, you're normally extending one of the other elements, whether it's basic or the advanced elements. The advanced elements are core Moodle custom elements. So basically the core custom elements are known as advanced elements, and the custom elements are ones that you would have defined yourself. And handling of file uploads is a special case and will be discussed separately in this course. So all elements are added using the add element method or created using the create element method, right? And all calls expect at least 3 parameters. So the element type, so whether it's hidden, select, text, etc. The form name for the element, and the text for the element's prompt or the label. So the text for the label. And that's usually done by calling the get string function. Most also expect additional parameters, obviously, such as options for a select element. Optionally, an attributes array can be passed, which defines the HTML attributes that for the actual field, so width, color, whatever you want in there. So in this lesson, there's a handout of all the basic and advanced elements and the parameters that are expected. So there are only really 2 required steps to add an element to the form. You define the element with your add element, and then we have to set the element's type. So you specify the input parameters that you expect the field to comply with. So for example, param text or a param int, as we discussed in the Moodle API presentation. And UI elements such as headers don't really require that to be set. There are several other additional methods that are useful when defining forms, but we'll cover them in a later lesson. So if you remember from our previous visit to the form, only 2 steps required to add an element to the form, which is add element and set type. Not for all of them, but for most of them, you need to set the type. So let's look at some of the other methods. So add help button. Now we've come across this, we've seen the help button in action in previous examples, and we've even specified the help for a couple of our forms before. Okay, so this method requires the name of the form elements, so you can tie the 2 together, and really it's not really a button, it's more like a help icon that's displayed next to the element's text. Okay, the identifier help string title and constants. So both the title and the contents should be defined in the strings file. So Moodle gets the title from the string with the identifier specified, and the contents from the identifier specified with an underscore help appended. And so for example, if the title value is username, then the help contents will be username underscore help. And then the final parameter for add help button is the plugin component's name for where the strings would come from. Okay. The other method that is useful is the set default method. Now usually the default value of your elements in a form are set by the set data method, and that usually works if the form fields mirror the database record field names. So let's say if you're taking from configuration values and you want to set them as the default for your forms, you probably need to use your custom data to do that rather than rely on set data. But that would be the standard default behavior, is that the data would be set based on the table record that you are editing or creating. So if you can't use the set data, like I said, you would then use the custom data parameter to pass in data to your form, okay? And then you would then use that custom data. It comes into your form as underscore custom data property. You would then use that to set your default for your field. So there's an example there. You set default for no images, and then you get the custom data, underscore custom data, no images value, and set that as the default. Then we carry on with another method, the add rule, which allows you to specify rules for the field. So you would specify things like required. That would make the field required needs to be a value input. Max length, email, if it's only an email field. Alphanumeric and numeric. These are kind of rules that are now kind of built into HTML anyway. But remember, as we said before, we are working with an old HTML library. Continuing with the add rule, the method requires at least 3 parameters, but takes a total of 7. So you've got the element's name, the element that the rule is being applied to, the error message if the input is invalid, and usually got with a get string call, the rule type, like we've just mentioned on the previous screen, like required, max length, etc. Optionally, the data required by the rule, so like the maximum length for the max length rule. Optionally, whether to perform the validation on the server or on the client, which is the default. A Boolean value for client-side validation, determining whether the form should be reset if there's an error, and it defaults to false. Not much use in resets in current practice, is there? Anyway, and then whether to force the rule, a Boolean value, whether to force the rule even if the form element does not exist, which defaults to false. I'm not quite sure why that's there, but you never know. So you can see the documentation at the link in this presentation. Okay. So loosely related to rules are the disabled if and hide if methods. And these basically allow you to disable or hide an element in the form based on another element and its value. So you can conditionally hide or disable field values. Using the create element is usually used to group form elements which have a single label, and with the add group. So there's a link to the Moodle documentation for the form elements. So there are some special methods defined in our classes, and one of them is add action buttons, which adds action buttons to the form. And the function takes 2 parameters, whether to display a cancel button, which is default is true, and the text for the submit button, which is default is save changes from the core strings. So for modules, instead of extending the Moodle form, we have the mod_Moodle form extensions. So our forms extend that class rather than Moodle form itself. And that has some additional functionality, additional methods that relate to course modules. So one of them is standard_intro_elements, which adds an editor to allow the user to enter description. And if we say we support mod intro, then that field should be included. And then we've got the standard course module elements. Those are all the elements that are required for the course modules. So this will add those common fields that we have in our form. And in short, it adds the following: restrict access tags and competencies. And then the final one is add action buttons, which kind of overrides the Moodle form one, which adds additional buttons to the form. All modules should use this functionality to maintain consistency with all other modules. Now, one thing you might notice here is that in most of the other plugins, we add our fields to a form that's created by the actual core itself. And in this case, it appears that we create the form and then we ask the core to add fields into it. Now, this might be a legacy issue. It does seem to go against the current pattern with other plugins, where a lot of times you're just adding fields to an existing form. But that's how it works in Moodle at the moment. Okay, so several steps to defining an element for a form. So you add the element, you set the type, you optionally add some help, and then again optionally set the default value for the form element. So let's go ahead and define a form for our plugin. So it needs to go into the main folder, and we need a file called modform. I have to spell it properly. Okay, so this is our form definition. So we've got our usual stuff at the top. we are requiring our Moodle form mod form. That's our extension to extend Moodle form, and our form needs to be named Frankenstyle name underscore mod underscore form. Okay, and then all the form definitions, as we've mentioned before, are done in the definition function. So we start off by getting our M form, our Moodle form. Remember, this is the actual form itself. I think we've been through that before. So we're adding a header, we're adding a text, a name for our instance. We're adding a rule that it is required. We are adding a rule that it's got the maximum 255 character length, and it's being checked in the client. And we add a help button for it as well. Okay, we then add in the intro document. So here we're going the Moodle form extensions, so we call that. So that gives us the intro elements, the description field, and then we add another header. So we're splitting the form a little bit. Okay, and then we get the wiki URL, and what do? We pick up. So I could have used set data for this, but in this case what we're doing is we are using the custom data that's been passed in. If it's not empty and it has a value, we then set that as the value of our field. So we use set default. We set the type as a param URL. We add a rule that is required, and then we're adding a static label. So we're adding a little bit more help in the form. You'll see it when we render when the form is rendered. Then we have some checkboxes to no images, no links. I'm not going to go through these other aspects here. I've already described them to you. So no links, and still having some static stuff being generated on the screen. And then include citations. Now you will recognize those, isn't it? Include citations, no links, no images, Wikipedia URL. Yes, that came from our database. Okay, so those are part of our database table. Okay, and you can remember it here in our XML install XML file. I'm going to close this now. I don't think we're going to deal with it again. Okay, so that's our mod form, and we end it by adding in the standard course modules and then adding in the standard action buttons. So that's our form. We need to add quite a few language strings for our form, so let's do that now. So we've added in all these strings here to do with our form. Okay, not going to go through them. You can see them on the screen, and we'll see them when the form is rendered. Okay, this is another visit to the form API. So when you in your code, when you want to work with forms, you get an instance of the form class, and the parameters you pass through are all optional, but these are the standard parameters. Action, so it auto detect default, it works it out. That would be the URL to which the form is going to be submitted. Custom data, and I bolded that because that's an important piece of data that you will use quite commonly, because that's how you pass data to the form, data that can be used within the form itself. Okay, the method, which is by default post, the target, which is really deprecated now in XHTML, the attributes for the form, whether the form is editable, a Boolean value. So if you've set that false, none of the fields will be editable. And then your Ajax form data goes into the last parameter. That's our constructor. So what do we do with my form when we've got it? So we have some methods that we can call. These are useful ones. There are many more that you can look at in the code if you wanted to. So we have things like display and render, which prints or gets the form. So then we've got set data, which we've spoken about before, applies the database table values to the form itself. We have a method called validation. So once the form has been submitted, we can actually validate the data that's coming through. So if we've got special ones that we need to pick up, for example, we want to see whether it's an existing file name, etc., we could do some validation. Okay, and then the errors are sent back. So you set the errors on the element name in an errors array, and that means the form will be redisplayed with your error messages near the element that has caused the issue. And then there's a get data. So get data is when the form is submitted. So when somebody submits the form, you use get data to actually collect the data that's been submitted, and it will be null if there's no data submitted or the validation fails. You can check if the form's been cancelled, and you can check if the form has been submitted. So generally your process is, now this is working with the form, you would get your form as we mentioned in the first slide, and then we would optionally read data from the database and apply to the form using the set data. Okay, if we were going down that road, if it's being displayed for the first time, check if the form has been cancelled. So you can check if it's cancelled and then act accordingly, usually redirecting the user somewhere else. And then you can check if data has been submitted by using the get data method, and then process that if necessary. If it hasn't been cancelled or submitted, then just display the form with the display method. So that's the general process. So get the form. If you've got an existing record, get it from the database, apply it to the form, check if the form has been cancelled. If it has, act accordingly. We could have switched those two. Check if the data has been submitted, if the submission has been done with get data or is submitted, and then process that, and then redisplay the form if you wanted to, or you could redirect after processing the data. So let's look at file form elements. So Moodle provides 3 custom elements to work with file uploads, and they are very closely tied to the file API, which we'll discuss a little bit later in this lesson. So we've got the file picker, which is quite an appropriate replacement for the HTML file element. Really useful to just get a file that you want to process and then discard like a CSV upload. We've got the file manager, which is the one that we've used in our code, which is the recommended way to get uploaded files and to save them to appropriate file areas. So this is to actually save the files. And then the editor, the text field, is replaced by editors in the form API. And so this is the specialized text editor, the HTML editor. So it's not strictly a file element, but it does allow the use of files such as images, etc. within the HTML, and so you need to manage that. Now we're not going to touch on the editor at all in this course. We're going to leave that for some other time, but we will be looking at the other two. So the file elements have an optional options array, and in our code it was described as the attributes rather than the options, but these are the options. Subdirectories, whether or not to include subdirectories, obviously not relevant to file picker. So file picker only deals with one file. It's a straight similar replacement to HTML file. So anyway, we carry on. Max bytes, the maximum size of the file that you will allow to be uploaded. The area's maximum bytes, again, not applicable for file picker, but that's the maximum file area size that we want for the area where we're saving our files. The maximum number of files, again, not applicable to file picker, but the maximum number of files that you will allow in your particular area. Then you have the option to set the accepted types of files that you will allow, and you can use extensions as shown on the screen, or file types such as audio, video, document, etc. And there's somewhere in the code you can actually find the whole list of those. And then we've got return types, what kind of return values is going to come back for that file. So we've got file external, file internal, file reference, or file controlled link, which will be discussed. We'll discuss a little bit later. But we use file internal because the file is being saved internally in Moodle. The editor has other specific editor options, as you can expect. The file types, the ones we just spoke about, are actually defined in the repository libphp file, which seems to be a weird place to put it, but repository and the file API, there's no real repository API as such. It's a file API, and repository plugins and the file API are very much connected. You could go so far as saying repository is part of the file API, I suppose. So the files that are uploaded to Moodle's internal file system, the one that will end up in the file areas and in the file table, are file internal. Where the file remains in an external repository, the file stays out and is only accessed via link, then that's a file external type. And then there's a variation of the file external type in the file reference type, which still refers to a file that is not internal but can be cached locally. And so you have to put in some functionality to keep that cache updated or synced with the actual file that's in the external repository. Then we've got the file controlled link. Now, I'm not quite sure what that is. It was introduced in version 3.3. The documentation says the file remains in the external repository, but it's not very clear what it is. So you'd probably look it up if you needed to use something like that. So adding the file picker to a form is fairly straightforward. You got to add element, file picker, etc. as normal. And then when the form is submitted, to get the content from the file, you will just get file content element name and load it into a variable, a content variable. Note, the underlying PHP call is file get content, so the contents are returned as a string. So watch out if it's a CSV file and you want to process it, you will need to do something to convert your string into an array and then process your data. And then just to get the file name, you have a call get new file name. And again, it's coming from your Moodle form, the definition. Okay, the file manager is much more closely tied with the file API. The process kind of follows this kind of step. You get a draft file area ID. This is the area where the files will be stored first while you're working on them. So while you're uploading them, while you're editing the form, etc., the files are copied or are worked with in the draft area. So you get the draft area ID. That value, the draft item ID, is what is ultimately used to populate the value of the file manager element. So basically a file manager element is a number, basically. And that's what guides the whole process of dealing with the file. So you prepare the draft area file using the ID by preparing the draft area. So existing files could be copied into that area before the form is displayed, or you prepare the draft area to accept a brand new file. And then after submission, when you finally got the final submitted data, you can then save the files from your draft area back to your components file area. So each component, each plugin manages its own area. So just think of it as a separate directory where your files are stored. So that's it for the presentation. To watch other extracts from the course, click on the playlist link, or alternatively, watch the video describing the course content. Don't forget to subscribe and like, and thanks for watching.